A very common problem on some of the earlier Sony VHS machines, such as the slv555, 575, R5, all the early ones, was they had a defective capstan motor that the material that they made the bearing out of was too thin and it tended to bend, and then you'd end up with a dragging capstan that would slow down every rotation. I'll show you guys how to fix that on this one. Now, machines that suffer from this, when you're playing a tape, the picture, especially on the EP speed, may momentarily pause and you'll hear rubbing, like a every time the capstan motor makes one rotation. It will drag on, the rotor will drag on the stator. And initially, we changed the motor. And then Sony came out with a replacement bearing, which was a little beefier, and we could take the motor apart and just change the housing. But you don't have to do that. You can actually bend the original housing back, and it'll last for years. And you can just keep straightening it every time it bends, because the parts today are not available anymore. Let's get this one apart and see what type this one has inside. So this machine actually has the newer bearing housing, because the original one, that aluminum top there, was actually a copper colored. And the difference is the actual housing itself is thicker, but they still bend as this one has. On the old style, the bearing cap is more of this color. So if you see one of those ones, you know it's one of the older styles. But as I say, both of them bend. This one here is a little stronger than the other one, but they both experience the same problem over time. To access the motor, we first need to remove the bottom cover. Then we need to remove the circuit board, remove the arrow mark screws, and there'll be a couple of connectors that have to be undone, and then that board will lift out. Then we can access the capstan motor. So let's remove the board now. We now need to remove the connectors for the loading motor and the drum motor. We don't need to disconnect the mode switch or the interconnect to the main board, as the cable is long enough. We can just lift the board up and out of the way, and just flip it out of the way. Next, we unplug the capstan motor connector, and we could remove the tooth belt. There's one bracket that needs to come off that holds the motor in place, so we'll remove that and remove the belt. Now we can unbolt the motor from the other side. There's 3 screws holding it in on the top side. Third screw, you have to move the audio control head out of the way to access it. So we're going to remove those 3 screws, and that'll allow the capstan motor and the bearing assembly to be removed. Although not necessary, some people find it easier if they remove the pinch roller assembly, which can be done by just releasing these 2 catches, lifting the retainer off, and then lifting the pinch roller off. Now be careful not to let that tower gear slip, so put the retainer back on. That way you don't have to worry about the alignment coming apart. That just makes it a little bit easier to get a screwdriver in and undo one of the screws. So we'll remove the 3 screws and drop the capstan motor out through the bottom of the unit. Now the motor is free, we can remove it from the bottom. We do need to remove the brake lever that brakes the motor. One little catch, there is a spring there, so be careful, otherwise the spring could go flying. Once you've removed the brake arm, the motor will just lift right out, and now we can repair or replace the motor bearing assembly. To replace the bearing assembly, you have to pull the magnet or the rotor out, and then there's 3 screws that will attach the bearing to the motor base. Now what happens is the metal was a little thin on the early versions, and it allowed it to bend and allowed the rotor to make contact with the stator itself and would wear it out. So what we need to do is bend it back if the bearing housing itself has become bent. But here's how you separate the two. You just pull the 2 of them apart. It is kind of stiff because the magnet is going to try and attract itself to the stator assembly. There are two little washers. You got to be careful that you don't lose them. One goes at the top and the other one goes at the bottom. They are to keep the oil in the bearing and stop it from migrating down the capstan shaft and onto your tape. So be careful with those two little plastic washers. Also, once you've got the rotor assembly out, this is a strong magnet, so keep it away from anything that could stick to it. So keep it away from anywhere where there might be metal filings, because if you get anything on the magnet, that is obviously going to rub against the coil and damage the stator coil. Motors that have been rubbing, you'll find the insulation has been worn and the copper will be a bright, shiny copper in severe cases when the bearing assembly has bent. So what we need to do is we need to straighten this bearing, because the reason it bends in the first place is because of the spring tension pushing it towards the back of the VCR from the pinch roller. So the pressure that's always on the pinch roller has a tendency to bend it. So what we need to do is we need to counteract that by bending it back slightly the other direction. Also, keep an eye on that surface mounted cap, because they have a tendency to go open and they are coupling the feedback loop. So if that goes open, the motor won't run at the correct speed. When reassembling the motor, put both of the washers both at the top end, stack them on top of each other, and then you can slide the motor into both of the washers. And once your motor is in place, it will set both washers at the top. Pull the motor down again, like pull the stator down again, and you can take the bottom washer and carefully push it down. Then allow the rotor to reseat. That will reseat the top washer. Push the bottom washer down to the bearing. That will prevent any lubricant from getting into position or getting out of position. It's best to always reseat the top washer a little bit higher, so that when you close down or reinsert the capstan into the bearing, it will reseat properly. And then again, do the same for the bottom bearing. Push it back into, or the bottom washer, push it back into the bearing housing so that nothing's exposed to the tape. We're now ready to reinstall the motor in the chassis. The motor assembly only fits in one direction. Once you've dropped it in place, a couple plastic catches will hold the motor in place. Now we can proceed with reattaching the brake assembly and spring, and then we can turn the unit over and reinstall the 3 screws that hold the capstan motor to the chassis. Once we've reinstalled the 3 screws that hold the capstan motor and bracket to the chassis, we can proceed with reinstalling the circuit board and the connectors. Okay, units back together. Let's load a tape and see if it plays. There we go. We got color bars and tone on playback. That's how you repair a bent capstan housing assembly on one of these Sonys. Thanks for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Bye for now.